19 Ways to Write C Major. Notation is countless things, operating in every way that it has ever been written, and each of these again in every way that they might be read. Among all the things notation is, all the things it could be, and all the time I have spent and will spend talking about it, it is not intrinsically important. A word that simultaneously encompasses the representative markings of Elizabeth Lutyens, Yoko Ono, and Anthony Braxton would seem to refer much more to the ways in which musicians read than the ways in which they write. It is, however, writing that I am primarily talking about today. Recently, before I am anything else, I am a score maker. It is at this point that I should clarify the contention of this presentation and my recent surrounding work, that notationness and scoreness are decoupled though often coincident properties. To be blunt about it, I am currently speaking in the assumption that scores don't inherently exist. Rather, scoreness is a quality ascribed or projected onto a notation or onto something else by a reader that is reading in a certain way. I am not, though, meaning this presentation to constitute an argument, much less a substantiated one. Instead, this is, really, an experiment, a filling of the idea with work that it might leak, as I am sure it will. In essence, I am hoping to be indulged, for which I apologize. Regardless, the case of scoreness, the abstraction through playing of a text into what might or might not be called itself or something else, is as curious as it has ever been. In the current framework, a dividing line might be drawn between the notation writing and the score reading as, respectively, ontological and epistemic figurations of the principles structuring a composition, or positing the notation as an object and the score as a thing. But this is more convenient than clear, and is quickly problematized by any consideration of the agencies of the assumedly real people involved in both endeavors, if the two endeavors can be safely separated. The recursive relationship of writing and reading is evidenced quickly in the breadth of recordings of any piece I might care to name here, and summed up nicely in the only line I like in Roland Barthes' otherwise frustrating vindication of Beethoven's piano sonatas. To compose, at least by propensity, is to give to do, not to give to hear, but to give to write. It is reasonably safely assumed, though, that time continues to move forwards, and so, in the case of written notation and reading of notation, reading, which may contain elements of writing, follows writing, which may contain elements of reading. To this end, I have previously found it useful, without expanding on any of them, welcome here to the expansion, to list a handful of ways that a notation, meaning any notation, might operate when read as a score by musicians, including as a map, as a funnel, as an invitation, as new car smell. I have similarly found it useful to list a handful of ways that any notation might operate if never read by musicians, including as an IOU, as an empty envelope, as a fire hazard. I am being silly about it, but the point is that the perhaps sole defining characteristic of a notation conceived as a score, separated from, say, a transcription, is that it is to be read towards an action. It is the future tense in perpetuity. Already, the decoupling of score and notation has two apparent person-sized ruptures: the notation writer's concern with the score reader's reading, and the score reader's translation of notation into the present tense. With this in mind, I wish to elaborate on one noted way that notation might operate in particular, as a map. By this analogy, as I have spoken about previously, I mean to include the glovebox map that might tell me the exit I need to take, leaving a given motorway if driving to Leeds, as I have been unable to do today, as well as the ordnance survey map that might tell me a given point's elevation above sea level. Similarly, I mean also to include the familiar and colonial map that greatly inflates the size of the UK and continues to understate the size of all Africa, the hand-drawn map on a napkin that might show me the way to the train station, and the map that says nothing at all that I am able to understand. I am talking about map-making in the simplest sense, as a figurative reduction of the object, adding or removing information in a manner the map-maker anticipates to be useful to the map reader, who may or may not be themselves. Though I am not meaning to propose this as an abstract truth, I mean it more like wearing a different hat. I have found this stance and others useful in stepping outside of the complicated meshwork of score-based practices and the work concept. Lydia Gurr wrote a great, complex book, already 30 years old, on the subject, and here it is childishly simplified. No one looking at a map of Milton Keynes would hold that it is Milton Keynes, nor say that through this map alone they know the place entirely. Equally, someone with a map of Lake Michigan might be able to tell me where the ferry goes from, but not how much it costs. At their most fundamental, maps are not concerned with any comprehensive level of detail or accuracy, but simply with their reader. Returning to notation, I am drawn, as I have been previously, to Sally Jane Norman's Objective Notation, a poetic reflection on the meshwork of notation presented at ERCAM's 2016 New Notations Symposium, which contains this line: "If our maps englobe territories, why bother to journey?" Though this presentation is concerned with notation and scoreness in the abstract, rather than any particular manner of notation, 1960s experiments with text notation by members of the Fluxus group and those adjacent to them generated a body of scores that are reductive in the sense noted previously, unconcerned with representing the entirety of an acted work, outlining a single action that is often abstract or mundane to the point of abstraction, and given without indication or preparation or consequence. I am thinking of scores by George McCunis, Anaya Lockwood, Milan Knežak, Lamont Young, and others, where a concise example might be Knežak's 1965 piece, which reads, "Get a cat." Here, to me, the material of the piece is living with a cat, replete with responsibility, companionship, cost, and substantive change to the performer's life going forward. All of this could have been marked in notation by a composer communicating differently, but has not been. Similarly, Christopher Fox's note on reeling is useful here. I have sometimes explained to the work's subsequent performers that the score is an indication of what should be done to create the work, reeling, rather than a definitive representation of that work. In another direction, the inclusion of an unnecessary detail might operate similarly. Jörg Frei's Klavierstück 2 features a handwritten bar of 468/4 filled with crotchet repeated fourths. An identical sounding result might have more efficiently been achieved with one crotchet and times 468, or simply even for 10 minutes. But the chosen notation, in my reading, foregrounds thoughts on labor, patience, and attention that gradually give way to a meditative present tense. I have never not lost count, and I don't believe I've done anything wrong. These notations are of most interest to me, similarly, in the way they might highlight non-sounding aspects of a performance as a piece's primary material. I mean this in the way that two hikers, each equipped with different maps, encountered on the West Highland Way and asked what they are doing, might respond differently, with one walking to Milngavie and the other walking in the footsteps of Jimmy McGregor. For instance, Yoko Ono's Overtone piece reads simply as "make music only with overtones." A performance of this piece might conceivably sound indistinguishable from a spectralist construction for orchestra, or from Ellen Fullman's The Long String Instrument, or from John Leely's The Harmonics of Real Strings. In each case, I would hold it as distinct, separated by the score's framing of the acting intent. Overtone piece might also be considered a paradox, a concept piece. Overtones require a fundamental. It is this situation, where the readings of two or more different scores might engender an acoustically identical performance, that is of current interest to me and has been a site of play in my work for some time, leading to the present development of a text, 19 Ways to Write C Major, possibly with more ways. This text is an ongoing work in progress that gathers and details a scattering of notations that might beget the sounding of a C major triad. At the risk of disappointment, I should now clarify that, both due to the text being at this point incomplete, and the necessity for some degree of expeditiousness, this presentation will detail fewer than 19 ways of writing C major. Instead, I will give an overview of the text's aims. Again, this is not necessarily a specific argument, but an assemblage of work in anticipation of a leak, and consider a handful of its given examples in relation to one another. The text's introduction reads as follows. This is not an exhaustive list of all the ways to write a C major triad, and it never could be. As much as any of these following ways might beget a particular sounding of particular frequencies, they might equally be ways to bracket or codify incidental soundings, ways of thinking about what is being sounded, ways of hearing what is not sounding or not yet sounding, or any of countless other operations. None of these ways are, themselves, a C major triad. In whatever way they speak, and in whichever way they are read, each of them relies on varying literacies being held by the reader, languages, techniques, histories, physicalities, and more, in order to be read as pertaining at all to sound making. Similarly, each of them, too, includes the risk and the opportunity of being sounded as something other than the particular frequencies of a C major triad, if sounded at all. Commentary on the following given ways is not, as yet, intended as a scholarly evaluation, but as a personal experiment to encounter, again, the communicative acts in various notations often rendered transparent by literacy and familiarity. Unsurprisingly, an attentive reading of the text will reveal my own relative familiarities and unfamiliarities, though I am somewhat familiar with each given manner of notation. Pending further study, I have not included any ways with which I am completely unfamiliar, and hope this does not imply a privileging of those given. Though this text is not intended to constitute an argument, it explores through practice a consideration of scoreness as a way of reading, of looking for and finding things to do in a notation or in something else. Notation need not be present. I have recently found this approach to scores a useful one. At the core of this work is an attempt, quixotic as it is, to examine the communicative acts of these notations through simultaneous familiar and pretended unfamiliar readings. It is to look at them with both soft eyes and a squint, and to state the findings of both pursuits as if indistinct. Though I am loosely conforming to the common and non-exhaustive groupings of staff, verbal, and graphic notations, often discussed as ranging from more or less specific to more or less unspecific in the given order, each of the following examples requires certain literacies and extraneous knowledges being held by the reader. I would hold that none of these groupings is inherently more or less specific than another, but that some simply have more established practices of reading towards sound making, and that these practices are not trivial whether they are rendered transparent or not. 19 ways to write C major, possibly with more ways, presently with fewer ways. The use of a grand staff in these marks likely implies a keyboard instrument, but might also be intended as a reduction of ensemble material for the purposes of analysis, accompaniment, translation, or anything else. If assumed for a keyboard instrument, the intonation of these given pitches is not specified but contextually determined by surrounding factors. A recently tuned piano in London, played intentionally in the conventionally inferred meaning of the mark, will sound certain equally tempered pitches. One in Dusseldorf will sound others. A justly intoned harpsichord or organ will sound yet others still, these likely differing from each other in different performances. In the case that any of these instruments is out of tune, within their conventions of intonation, these marks might operate more as a tablature, a figuration of physical action rather than a figuration of specific sounding. Register and voicing of the C major triad is specified, and the conventions of these markings afford the additional specification of articulation. Duration is here not generally specified absolutely, but relatively, though an absolute duration might be detailed by a given relative absolute. In contemporary use, an absolute duration might be given directly. A reader at the keyboard is likely to depress the corresponding keys with fingers comfortable and contextually practical for them, if fingers are the chosen depressors, though the conventions of these markings also afford the specification of fingering. In the first example, the triad is likely inferred, by a familiar reader, as an Ionian tonic, informing an anticipated structure of sound events that might follow it. In the second example, the triad is likely inferred as an Ionian dominant, though it might reasonably be any diatonic chord in any diatonic mode, again informing an anticipated structure of sound events that might follow it. In the third example, the triad is stated as entirely outside of the implied mode, leading to different anticipations of different events. In the fourth example, differing from the first only in that it is written by, hypothetically, Alban Berg, the triad is likely inferred, if read by a reader familiar with both the mark, the conventions of the marking, and the musical historic context of Alban Berg's compositional language, as illustrative of no functional mode, related to possibly following sound events only in their direct relation as sounds themselves. In each example, an unfamiliar reader is unlikely to make any sound resembling a C major triad. The first of these examples contains many of the same implications as the previous four, with new complications. No instrument that habitually reads alto clef is in the general practice of sounding three pitches simultaneously. This might be done, for instance, on a viola with a curved bow, but the close cluster of the given pitches would also necessitate the use of an alternate tuning. A determined reader might assume this mark to be for a divided viola section, or a reduction of other ensemble material made without favouring the grand staff. I have previously employed a similar mark in this way in my score for Lomond, using the alto clef to give 6 available pitch classes for an otherwise highly indeterminate piece, structured also by a stream of consciousness written text. This clef was chosen in part to put the score at a certain distance from players. Most players familiar with staff notation can read this clef, but, excluding violists, alto trombonists, some altos, etc., not at a glance. So an element of calculation is invited, followed by a keeping of the staff at arm's length and a consequent closer reading of the accompanying text. Players have generally encountered this with initial confusion, except violists, who have been generally pleased, and in some cases exasperation, but these feelings have been brief and the notation in the longer term effective for this. A non-trivial aspect of my fondness for the use of alto clef in my often very reduced use of staff material is that it is symmetrical around middle C, as is much of my music, and so much of my music looks better in alto clef. When previously given as a reason to players and readers of my music, this has fairly been met with yet more exasperation, but it also serves as a playful extension towards collapse of the logic behind the creation of multiple and movable clefs, to minimize ledger lines by centering the desired music on the staff. To this end, I have given the sixth example, the triad stated in mezzo-soprano clef. This clef is seldom read in contemporary use, and might presently serve primarily as a reminder that all clefs are movable. My own personal visual satisfaction with the now centered triad comes at the cost of my new dissatisfaction with the now decentered clef, but the point is useful. There is an established balancing of literacies between the affordances of the clef and the affordances of the staff, and both are easily destabilized if not used carefully in tandem. Additionally, for however unstable both of these examples might be to some habitual readers of other clefs, a reader unfamiliar with staff notation is no less likely to make any sound resembling a C major triad than in the first four examples. These examples appear similarly reduced, but communicate entirely different intentions to different practices and literacies. They are the most visually plain common marks used to denote a triad. The seventh, which might, for instance, be found above the staff on a lead sheet, does not specify register, voicing, timbre, or articulation. A common use of this mark might anticipate the reader contextually determining these elements appropriately. It would also be anticipated that a reader is aware of the convention that this mark implies more than one pitch class, and is aware of the relationship of those pitches. Common performance practice of this notation convention, likely known to the writer, might involve the sounding of multiples of any number of the three implied pitch classes, the omission of any number of them, or the inference of the mark to inform and structure melodic phrasing that might contain other pitch classes and might not contain any of those directly implied. The eighth example foregrounds function and defines the triad as relational. In its conventional usage, it might serve to contextualize other marks or sounds rather than to invite the production of any particular sound. It might just as easily refer to an A major triad, a B flat major triad, a B major triad, and so on, and only denotes a C major triad if given alongside extraneous information in conventions of harmony understood by both writer and reader. It implies the analysis of structure, and so it implies the presence of structure. As a related aside, a musicology joke. Steve Reich's Four Organs is an expounded dominant 11th chord. A musicologist asks, the dominant of what? The ninth example, which might be found on what is sometimes dismissed as a cowboy chart, is something of a hybrid of the two preceding it. It implies the same structural relationships, replete with the same anticipated awareness of structural convention, as in the analytical example, with the same implied agencies of register, voicing, timbre, and articulation as in the former. It is the seventh mark expressed relationally that it might just as easily be any other major triad if a context of performance, for instance, the particular range of a vocalist, calls for transposition. The first of these examples is a notation only in that it has been written down. It is not an encoded figuration of sound, but a direct request written in the language that it might have been spoken. Accordingly, within the remit of the present work, it might reasonably be considered cheating, though I have encountered similar notations and deployed them in my own work. In order to comply with the request, a reader would need similar prior contextual knowledge regarding what a C major chord is and how to actualize it as in examples 7 to 9, but this 10th example is both the first given that speaks directly to a reader and the first that explicitly asks them to do anything, and asks this quite nicely. Example 11, though included playfully, is a problematized version of the prior. It is unclear whether the notation, speaking to the reader in the same manner, requests the playing of a major chord, of which C major is as appropriate and as likely as any other, or intends what otherwise might have been presented more clearly as, please play A major. The performance of an A major chord, of course, would satisfy both requests. Though this example is simplified, similar ambiguity is present to some degree in any notation, and might be regarded by a given composer as a risk, an opportunity, or irrelevant, depending on their own aesthetics. In my own work, I have treated this as a welcome inevitability, guided somewhat by a thought of Daniel James Wolfe's that I think about often. imaginative and enlightened misreadings and inspired but unfaithful interpretations are non-trivial skills. A willingly unfaithful reading of any notation, other than those clearly detailing a C major triad, might reasonably result in the sounding of a C major triad too, and so example 12 is given here as a joke, a notation of which a determined and likely playful misreading might phoneticize the notation as a chord, of which, again, C major is as appropriate and likely as any other. The examples and commentary given above are representative of developing work and a developing approach to work that I hope has been of interest. In thinking about how to wrap up without an argument to conclude, I have decided that a fitting end to the present presentation is a simple reading of the most specific way of writing C major that I can think of, itself being specific to the collapsed point of absurd uselessness to the overwhelming majority of instrumentalists, though it is quite actionable for anyone equipped with a synthesizer or a computer. The simultaneous production of 261.63 Hz, 329.63 Hz, and 392 Hz, or their halves or doubles, or the halves or doubles of these halves and doubles, and so on, intonated within acceptable tolerances, see small print, and presented such that they are perceived as intentionally coinciding, combining to the reception of themselves as part of a coordinated whole that might be recognized and named as such, small print. These tolerances are to be malleably derived from numerous contexts, including but not limited to period, region, function, instrument, proficiency, genre, etc.